This project was born out of the words that we heard from many of you who were in Vancouver in 2015, and that is that that there's a lie that lots of people believe around the world, and whether they're patients or doctors or individuals, they believe the lie that skin diseases don't matter. That skin diseases don't have an impact, and we all know, everybody in this room knows that that's just simply not true. So we don't believe that lie. So what we do know to be true is that there are over 3,000 skin diseases globally, that people with skin disease have poor access to care and treatment, that there's a markedly underestimated burden of disease. So this whole notion of impact that Natalie was talking about is a key piece that we need to change the way the world sees dermatology, and we need to make people understand that impact of disease matters. So we also know that there are psychosocial, educational, and economic impact and associated comorbidities that affect people living with these diseases. So the challenge broken down, and again, this is where we go to what Natalie was talking about. HTA bodies want unbiased information and input from patient organizations about the impact of disease. Patient organizations struggle to find and put together scientifically validated information and data. And while patient stories provide good input and good information, they aren't data. And what we do know, or what we've been told, is that HTA bodies or decision-making bodies in countries where there is no HTA, the way they make their decisions is often data-driven. All of the other information that they get in is data. So they've got a rubric that has numbers, and then we can give them stories. And while that adds flavor, it doesn't. What we find is that they come back to us and they say, yes, it was really helpful that we got that information, but they can't tell us what percentage of their decision was made using our information. And they typically, that's typically hard for them to quantify, because we aren't ever necessarily giving them data that they can systematically put into their system. So, and the other issue is that currently quality of life and burden of disease studies and data is produced and designed by doctors and researchers. So we all know, and we've had examples earlier today about situations in which patients themselves brought different endpoint ideas or different things to the table that mattered to them that the researchers and the doctors hadn't considered. So question is, how do we gather and provide patient-derived, patient-reported impact of disease? And how do we do it in such a way that the HTA bodies can use it and can systematically put it into their decision-making processes? Every point going forward, patient-reported impact of disease is part of every decision that gets made. So what if quality of life was measured using a measurement tool developed and designed by patients? What if a credible voice, patient voice, could be built on verifiable data? And what if, and this is the big what if policymakers would never, ever make another decision without including a patient measure? So what is GRIDD? What is GRIP? It is the very first global patient-initiated research project in all of dermatology. It's the first global project on disease burden in multiple skin diseases. We've got a groundbreaking patient-led methodology that Christine's going to describe in a minute, called GRIP. What is going to come out of this is a unique new patient-reported impact measure, and the questions in that measure are created by gathering patient views on the impact of the disease on themselves and their family member. And part of that process was begun a couple of days ago here in Milan with a session that Christine and her team ran. And the thing that I also want to say, and actually this is for your benefit, Natalie, this is a process that's being piloted in dermatology. But once this methodology, once the GRIP method has been validated in dermatology, it is our plan to actually share that with other therapeutic areas, because at the end of the day, we want this methodology to be used across the board and be integrated so that no decision ever gets made without having a patient-led measure as part of the decision-making process. So this is not just about dermatology. We are the testing ground. We are the ones that are lighting this particular fire. This is one of those chances where we get to lead the world. So I'm going to pass to Christine.
Okay, so I want to pick up on a couple of things that Christine has already said that are really important. I come from I am a psychologist. My discipline is as a psychologist. I've spent 20 years doing research into people living with long-term conditions. Okay, and latterly over the last 10 to 15 years, I've worked in dermatology, but most of that, if not all of it, has been in psoriasis. And I mistakenly thought that the measures and the methodology and the quality of the research that we produce in psoriasis was applicable in all other skin conditions. And it wasn't until I got in touch with this project that I realized that even within dermatology and skin conditions, there are orphan conditions. There are some conditions that have little or no research associated with them. And there are other conditions that have biomedical research, genetic-based research, but nothing up the patient end. So the playing field, even within dermatology, is not even. So we started to adopt the project and to adopt the usual scientifically rigorous methodological approach to looking at building a new measure, almost irrespective of what field it was in. And what I began to realize very quickly is in dermatology, we have an anomaly that there doesn't exist in any other long-term conditions. And that is the most commonly used measure doesn't have good psychometric properties. What I mean by that is it's not necessarily scientifically sound, but yet it's used all over the world and it's used in almost everybody's clinic. So it was very hard then to criticize that measure. So park that thought as we go through this process. So our research objectives in the GRIDD program were to conduct a systematic review of the scientific literature. Why is that important? Because we might have missed something, the gold standard measure that was out there just not being used. It might have been somebody's MD thesis that was sitting on a shelf somewhere, or it might have been one pocket of excellence somewhere in the world where people are using this measure that's not widely known. So we needed a very strict methodology, a rigorous methodology to uncover all the measures that are out there, even if they're not very well known. And that's known as a systematic review. So the first thing we did was conduct the systematic review and then to think about how can we encourage and involve as many patients as possible in this new process. Because normally when you're developing a new measure, you would speak to some patients, but the numbers would be very small. They would not necessarily be widely representative of other patients like them. And so what clinicians have defaulted to, this is not blaming, this is just a statement of fact, is to work from their perspective and think, well, I've worked with patients, I've seen patients for the last 20 years, I think I have a good idea of what their issues are. And that's not an unreasonable thing to think. But it's not accurate because they are not living with the condition day after day. They are not managing, navigating healthcare systems in the way that I've heard about this morning. And so we needed to ensure that we spoke to the right people in sufficient numbers to be confident that the qualitative work, what you're telling us, gets translated into this new measure. So we thought long and hard about how to do that. We're very aware that within the dermatology population, that some people because it's such a visible condition, very often, some people are reluctant to talk about their condition, even with clinicians. And we know that's the case because we conducted those studies out of Manchester over the last 10 years. And we found that even patients will hide from clinicians the impact that it really has on them. And so there is this concept, this thing called alexithymia, which is where people can't identify their emotions, can't put a name to it, and then furthermore can't talk about it easily. So we needed not just simply to ask people, tell us what it's like living with these skin conditions. We needed to find other ways in order to uncover that, more creative ways. So one of the things that we've done, and many of you will have completed this exercise, so thank you, is to draw a picture or to bring an object, something that represents for them what it's like living with a skin condition. And layered on top of that, we're talking to people, we're asking them standard questions. And for those of you who took part in the first part of the exercise, we drilled down very specifically through case studies, what's it like for this person in the case study living with this skin condition, part one. Then step back and ask yourself, what would it be like for you in this condition, living with this skin condition? So we've now got a rich plethora of data that we are in the process of analysing and turning into, translating into questions that will come out on a questionnaire. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So that's what's new about this methodology. It's allowed us to really talk to as many people as possible, to probe, to question, to ask questions in unusual ways, to get answers that are not readily tripping off people's tongue. So what we've done is we've started the ball rolling. We're now into phase 2 of the project. The project has 5 phases. We're into phase 2 already. And the point is to gather data in as many different ways as possible, with as many different people as possible, to ensure that nobody's missed, no issues are missed in this process. So this is the GRIDD team, some absent members. Professor Augustine is not able to be at this meeting, but one of his team, Nero, can you stand up so that people can see who you are? Nero is from the German team. Christine, you'll know about. You've seen Christine rather a lot at this meeting. That's wonderful. She runs the show. That's me. And Rachel Pattinson. Rachel, can you stand up? Rachel is conducting the first IADPO Global Skin Matters PhD. So she'll be Dr. Pattinson at the end of this process. And I think, that's one thing that we can be very proud of in this organization, that we're producing the next generation of researchers to take this forward. Thank you, Rachel. I've borrowed 2 of my other researchers from my psoriasis research in Manchester. Can you both stand up, please? Evan, who's working with us in Cardiff, and Rach Hewitt, who's also working with me in Cardiff. And they've loaned us their time because they're working on psoriasis projects and they have qualitative expertise. They are used to conducting skilled interviews with people to try and get under the radar to find out what people's concerns are. Thank you both. And of course, Jennifer, you'll know Jennifer and you'll know Shona. So we're a mixed group of clinicians, researchers, and GlobalSkin people. So that's the overarching team. Okay, so Christine, you're going to talk to this one?
So I'm just going to do a quick overview about really what the thought process was, how we thought we would develop this, so that you see where you fit and where your disease area fits. So this is actually phase 2 and onwards because the literature review has now been done. So where are we now? We're now at the issue collection stage. So step number 1 here, the GRIP stage. And, oh yeah, thank you. Where Christine's team is gathering issues generically, but also by disease. So part of the process, the last couple of days was some generic gathering, but there will be issues that are gathered that are specific to each and every disease that we represent. And we're hoping that at the end of the day, after those issues get analyzed, we're going to end up with basically, for every disease, a two-part measure, where one part of it is generic, that applies to all diseases, all dermatological diseases, and the second part is disease specific. So here we've just picked a couple of diseases, but you can see there would be potentially a line there for your disease, and this chart can go on. How many diseases have we got? 46 or 60 or? Okay, over 60. So add 60 to that. So this is like a humongous project. The other piece about this is that while it's disease specific, we're also gathering it in countries, and we're also gathering it in regions, so that at the end of the day, the data that this project will produce will be a grid of data that is by disease, by country, or by region, and globally. So, you want to, actually, can I have that thing? Because now I got to drive for a little while. Which means that you're going to have data to support your advocacy work, your communications campaigns. You're going to have data that you're going to be able to use when you go to your HTA body that is going to be scientifically valid. It's going to have come from a process that they will recognize, or they'll be able to recognize as being rigorous. It can also inform research and development priorities. So imagine if you represent a rare disease or a disease in which there has been very little research. You now have some data that says, hello, this disease is really impacting people very seriously, and here we have data to show you. And that might then interest some biotech companies or some pharmaceutical companies or some university researchers to take on the next steps. The other piece is that having this information, this data, it validates patient experiences. It's a great thing when you're a patient to hear that everybody else feels the same way you do, and the issues that you find important are, in fact, issues that others with your disease also find important. And finally, the piece falls into the advocacy piece as well, is I think if we can show that these diseases matter, that these diseases truly impact people, then we can increase timely access to treatments. Part of the appeal for us globally is that we also think that this campaign that we're talking about, where we want to change the way the world sees dermatology, we want to affect policies at even the global level, get involved with the WHO, perhaps get an all-skin resolution. We can do that if we have solid data. So in this case, more is more. The more of you that get involved, the more data we have, the more robust the entire program is. So benefits for you and your organization: you'll have increased credibility in advocacy. It gives you multiple contact points for your members, because you're going to be going out with questionnaires validating the qualitative part in part 2, in phase 2, and as well as going out in phase 3. You'll now have, as Amanda talked about this morning, you'll have facts, you'll have numbers to attach to any media you want to, any media stories. And also, it can help boost your fundraising, because if you're now going to be more effective in your advocacy and in your outreach, you now have some data to use. So you and your patients are a key part of this whole GlobalSkin movement, and this is a part of our process for changing the way the world sees dermatology. So using it for advocacy in particular, as I said, by disease, by region, by demographics. The other piece of this that I haven't even mentioned is that we're going to need to translate and culturally adapt each and every one, for different countries, for different regions. We're going to need to do that piece of work, and that's actually built into this plan. At the end, when we have data, we're going to have a conference, we're going to have a meeting where we're going to focus on how you use it. We're going to provide you with tools, with training. And so 2019, we're starting this. 2021, we expect to have some data at that point, and we're going to be putting a lot of emphasis on how we can now all use that data that information in our own communities. And again, our hope is to create a global movement, one skin, one voice, one world, and ultimately and change policy at the WHO, UN level, and help you change policy in your countries. This is, and I'm not going to go into any kind of detail, this is roughly what the phases look like, and this information, I think a lot of it is actually on our website. This is the timeline for the phases. And so we are now in 2019, phase 2. As you can see, there's a bit of a rollout. 2021 and 2022, that's where we're looking at the rollout, the data rollout, and the communication strategies, all of which have been built into the project. And now I'm going to pass the baton back to you.
Just to reiterate the point that data, numbers, are very important. Government bodies, pharmaceutical companies, researchers, we're all about numbers. But we're not only about numbers, we want the stories that support the numbers. That's why this is so important. So my team went to the literature and identified that there were over 12,000 references to measures in existence. Measures of quality of life, measures that were claiming to report patient impact on patients' lives. From that, we drilled down to 702 that were likely candidates for us to scrutinize in more detail. So we can sift an awful lot of the publication information here. There was duplicates, sometimes there were measures where the titles were not accurate, they weren't actually, papers were not really talking about the things that were in the title. So many of those initial tranche of information seeking, many of that could be eradicated. But we found that there were around 702 pieces of information, scientific papers that we had to read and scrutinize very carefully. And if I tell you that reading one paper probably takes about 45 minutes, would you say? Yeah. That's why we have a team of people involved with this process. It's very lengthy. We ended up with 36 potential candidates, ones that we felt confident really spoke to us as quality of life measures. So we know that the burden, it's talked about as burden, which is not a very helpful word, but I guess that you living with these conditions know that it is actually a burden. But the real burden estimates on the impact of skin diseases should be based on the highest possible quality of evidence. But it isn't always. We know that's the case. But we, with our scrutiny, with our careful scientific process, we filtered out the areas within those scientific publications that didn't stand up to scrutiny. We know that patient-reported outcome measures, PROMs, are used all over the world. They're used for decision making. So we really needed to test them, to test how valid and reliable they were. Do they stand up to this scrutiny? And to our surprise, we found that, just to say, when I talk about validity and reliability, those are two very specific technical terms that look at, is this measure measuring what it claims to measure? Is it accurate? And does it do that over time? Is it stable? Does it do it reliably? Those are the two top line, most basic criteria on which measures should be evaluated. But what will probably surprise you is many of the scientific papers and the measures that we scrutinized didn't even really stand up to that level of scrutiny. Our surprise was that no study yet had applied this methodology, this systematic review methodology, to the existing dermatology PROs. We're rather glad that it hadn't been done, otherwise we could have gone home early. But it was rather surprising given the frequency with which they're used in clinical settings and in pharmaceutical clinical trials, pharmaceutical settings, and of course in government settings for decision making. So our aim was to identify and evaluate the existing dermatology patient-reported outcome measures and to make evidence-based recommendations for their future use, the ones that we thought would be best to make an evidence statement about use this one, don't use that one, for example. Okay, so we searched the published literature. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but we used a very standardized technique for doing it. So we searched all of the potential repositories for information, and we were very specific upfront in advance of doing any of this what our methodology would be. And that methodology has been published and it conforms to the gold standard method for looking for evidence-based information. So we included all of those instruments into our mix. We spent we burnt the midnight oil, spent lots of time poring over these measures, not with glasses of wine. And then at the end of it, we've come out with some recommendations. We've used this strategy called the COSMIN strategy, which is consensus-based standards for the selection of health status measurement instruments. Don't worry about it. The one thing that you need to know is this is the gold standard for doing this kind of work. If a piece of work has been done and not used this standard, it's already on rather shaky scientific ground. But we published this up front, so everybody in the scientific community knew what we were about to do, and it's been peer-reviewed and deemed to be an acceptable method. Okay, so this is what we found. Our recommendations would fall into three broad categories. And so in category A, we could say with confidence that this instrument has good enough evidence for validity and reliability, and it can be recommended for use. So that would be our considered gold standard. In category B, we could say, again, and defend these statements, that the instrument can't be categorized as A, the best, or C, the worst. It has some potential, but there are some problems within it. And then finally, category B, where the instrument has a good indication that this measure should not be used. Okay, so sufficient flaws that we can say, don't use this instrument. Now remember that many of our colleagues have produced these instruments, so we had to tread carefully here without being hypercritical of people. But at the same time, they are our colleagues, but they're also our scientific colleagues. And so they accept that this work has been rigorous and it's acceptable to criticize each other's work. So what did we find? Okay, within category C, i.e. do not use, we got 7 instruments. Within category B, use with caution, and we got 30 instruments that fell into that category. And then finally, in category A, in category A, which is the gold standard, we had no measures that fell into that category. So out there in the world, with all of the instruments that are being used on a regular basis for a variety of ways, they do not stand up to scientific scrutiny, which is quite shocking. Okay, so which ones, you'll all be keen to know, which ones fell into which category? So within category B, I'm not going to go through each of them, you'll recognize some of them. Oops, sorry. The most commonly used instrument is the Dermatology Life Quality Index, but what you'll see is that fell into category B, use with caution. The Patient Benefit Index, which has come out of Matthias Augustin's work in Germany, is more of an economic impact measure. Again, use with caution. The Skindex, Well, all of the other measures that are used within a clinical setting and within clinical trial settings, category B, use with caution. Okay, some of the ones that fell into category C, i.e. do not use, they're not scientifically rigorous enough. We've got the usual ones. Unfortunately, many of my colleagues in Cardiff are translating the DLQI into a number of different other languages. But if we remember that the whole scientific basis of the DLQI says use with caution. Okay, but there we are in the gold standard bracket, the gold standard basket. There are no existing measures, which is good news for us in a way. But it's also not really good news because we had assumed that some of the measures out there were measuring what they claimed to measure, had been built in a way that was sustainable in scientific terms and is measuring things reliably. But what we will have eventually is we will have our measure in this category, because the single biggest criticism of the measures out there was insufficient patient input at the early stages of the development of the instrument. So we've at least overcome that hurdle with having significant patient input from a variety of different ways to building the new measure. Okay, why does this matter to us? If we are going to produce data, numbers that will be used for decision making at high levels about resource allocation, and for clinicians in every clinic all over the world to assess the impact that living with a skin condition has on an individual, this needs to be scientifically rigorous, and it needs to be defendable. So we will have the first study that uses this methodology using the strict guidelines that we've put every other instrument through. So we know that there isn't currently one in use, but we also know that we are well into the process of developing the measure that will overcome some of these problems. We're not going to ignore what clinicians say. They have experience that we need to feed in. But the most important thing is that we change the weighting so that patients are truly represented on this new measure. Okay, so we've got the justification that we knew that we needed to have, even though we felt instinctively there was room for this measure. What was encouraging, I guess, was that we have found that in fact we did need this measure. And so we've got the justification that we can go ahead with this project, and we're now ready to move into some of the other stages. So what's happened so far? Skilled interviewers have run a series of face-to-face meetings, and you've all been part of that. Some of you, most of you. Who wasn't at the first session? Okay, not that many actually. Quite a lot of people were here, but the process now is about condensing all of that data that's come from you, and my job. And my team's job is to interpret that in a way that it speaks to the lady at the front with the red dress on, the lady with the green jumpsuit on, the person at the back of the hall, so that everybody feels that the measure has a question that they can relate to. Even if it's not very specific to them, they can see that it would relate to some people living with skin conditions. So that interpretation is a really important part of the process. So we will then reach out to a wider group of patients, and that's where you come in. As patient group leaders, you're a channel for us to provide information for you to disseminate to as many people as you can, as many people living with the skin condition you represent as you can, and for us to get information back from you. So it's now an open channel of communication, and we would strongly advise you to keep asking us about where the project is. We'll feed you information, but we also need information back from you. Okay, and all of that will feed into the analysis process, which takes a lot of time, unfortunately. This whole process of building a new measure is not something that can happen in a couple of months. It happens in a couple of years. For us to know, to be confident that this measure is what it claims to be, we need to carry out the process very efficiently. Okay, and then we will, once we've built the instrument, built the measure with the questions, and at that stage there will be many more questions that will appear on the final instrument, so bear with us when you see a lot of questions. They will further be reduced at some point in the process, but we'll put it out to you again and we'll ask you, are these the right questions? Can you see that anything is missing? Can you see that there's overlap between these questions? So can we reduce them into one differently worded question, for example? And then finally, the last part of the process is we will send out an online link to a survey that has the questionnaire measure in it to collect as much data as possible on the near final instrument. Now, in the meantime, we will be doing all of the statistical analysis on it to ensure that it's valid and reliable. So each time it comes out to you, it would have been through a further refinement process.
All right, so Chris has just talked about phase 2 and has given you the results of phase 1. So, as she said, at this point, once that instrument has been produced, then we'll be consulting with you, and we'll also be working with you on how best to reach your patients. What do you need to make that work? So there may be all kinds of different ways that we need to adapt in order to reach the widest possible audience. So at that in phase 3, we're going to be packaging and putting that GRIDD instrument together and testing it. We're going to be making those adjustments and testing for language and culture. So we're going to collaborate with you. You are critically important to this process. And at the end, you're going to get the GRIDD specific to your disease and language and country. And we're hoping that you're going to be able to then send it out, so the measure. And then ultimately the data comes back to our database, and they will, do their magic. And just so that you, because I'm sure this is a question that's going to come out, is who owns the data? We own the data. This is our data. It doesn't belong to anybody else, and you'll own the data. You'll be able to access it and cut it whichever way you like. We are not going to sell it. We're not going to. It's going to be for the use for the dermatological community, because at the end of the day, this is not about making money. This is about changing the way the world sees dermatology, making sure that people living with dermatological conditions, skin conditions, can lead healthy and productive lives. And so that's our end goal, and this is part of our way to that. So imagine if we could all work together to put the patient voice in the center of every decision that gets made. And then never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens, that's us, can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has.